As a child, I was a bird watcher. By the time I was 10 years old, I knew the names of 150 birds. I grew up in Greensboro. And I could find a bird's nest anywhere, and I knew the birds' habits. I think, in its own way, that trained me to be an architect. Because if you understand the habitat that a bird lives in, you understand about its place. By the way, a bird builds a better building than I will ever do. If you look at the way a bird builds a nest, it uses local materials, it's climatically responsible, and you can hardly see it. Late in my career, my primary goal has become to design buildings that you hardly see. The Lath House at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, for example, I designed in such a way that it became almost a background to the plants and the beautiful leaves and flowers that they have there. So I think my habits of observation were really formed when I was young, looking at things. When I was young, I used to draw. My mother was an artist, and I learned from her to draw and observe things. And that too, I discovered it was a way of seeing. Because if I drew something, I had to think really hard about it. I had to understand why it was that way. And also, if I drew something, I didn't forget it. Well, I've been an architect in North Carolina for almost 40 years. And my primary goal is to do buildings that fit where I am in North Carolina. I want somebody to look at a building and say, that building looks like it really belongs here. I don't want to design a building that looks like it could be in New York or California or London. I want it to be of its place. For that reason, I pay great attention to things like the climate of that place, where the good winds come from, where the bad winds blow, the topographical nature of the landscape, the hydrology, and I use all of those things to fashion a way to make a building that fits the place. Often my buildings have porches and deep overhangs. Typically they're made with materials that are either dug or harvested in North Carolina, such as Atlantic white cedar, which comes from swamps on the coast of North Carolina, or stone that comes from quarries in North Carolina. So my goal is to make buildings that seem at home in their place. Well, once I know the place I'm going to build, I go there and I stay there. Sometimes I camp out overnight in that place. Sometimes I'll spend the weekend outdoors just studying it. Usually I like to go with a landscape architect because the landscape's very important to my buildings. The building really begins with the landscape. So for example, the North Carolina Pottery Center, my late wife Judy and I, who was a landscape architect, went there for several weekends and stayed there all day studying the site and deciding what would be most appropriate. How could we add to this site in a way that made it better? How could we build there in a way that didn't detract from its existing qualities? Well, I started studying in 1959 at NC State in the School of Design. And at that time, the School of Design in architecture focused largely on modern architecture. In fact, there were very few courses on the history of architecture. The general feeling was that we as modern architects were going to create a kind of a new world, a new way of living. And the old ways of, using wood and stone weren't important. What was important was steel and glass and technology. And that was pretty much what I was taught. I won't deny that modern architecture was liberating. It brought a sense of openness to plan. It brought a sense of informality that is irreplaceable, and I still follow those principles of modernism. Well, see, up until then, I thought that one learned about architecture from books and magazines and what was current. But I started to look at the buildings around me, and this is when I realized that I learned best from something I could walk to. In other words, that I could touch or even draw. And so I started looking at barns. North Carolina has a rich history of barn building, in particular tobacco barns. In the Piedmont of North Carolina are all the same shape. They're about 24 feet by 24 feet by 24 feet high. They're based on the size of a tobacco plant because they're hung there to be flue cured. So although they're all the same, every one of them is different because the farmer who built it knew which way the winds were blowing from. And if he needed a porch to hang tobacco in the summer, he wouldn't put it on the west side of the barn. He'd put it on the east side of the barn because he knew that the winds came from the west to the east in the summer and the tobacco wouldn't get wet. So every one of those barns is specific to its place. And it uses materials that are local to that place. Logs in many cases, or boards from a sawmill, often with a tin roof. And I came to realize that these buildings had inherent wisdom in them. It's not as though I was going to build a tobacco barn, but I could learn from these buildings and the attention paid to the landscape and to materials and use those in my buildings. It can be defined as architecture that's not done by an architect. Vernacular meaning it's part of a common language. I always think the best definition is vernacular architecture is what you do when you can't afford to get it wrong. The farmer who built that barn, the lives of his children depended on it. If that barn flooded, or if the wind blew it over, or if the wind didn't dry his tobacco, or if his cows got sick, that was it. And so vernacular architecture is what you do when you can't afford to get it wrong. You're not trying to be unique, you're not trying to be original, you're trying to do what's right. By paying attention to things like barns and then farmhouses, corn cribs, I started to realize that there were certain principles of design that made sense 100 years ago, but they also make sense now, like porches. You didn't build a farmhouse 100 years ago unless you had a porch. And where did you have that porch? You had it on the side of the house that faced south, because that's the most effective place to have a porch. The porch overhang shades the people sitting there in the summer, but it allows the sun to come in and warm the porch and the house in the winter. Fundamental principle. It's as valuable now in 2021 as it was in 1821 when Thomas Jefferson built a porch on Monticello. He, by the way, also sited his house in such a way that the southwesterly breeze could flow right through it. If you build a house today in, let us say, Raleigh, and you want to cool it naturally, you'll site it in such a way that you can open the windows and let the breeze flow through it. Most likely, that means you'll make that house face south, southeast, or southwest. That'll be where you put the porch. So there's some very basic principles that one can learn. There are also things like materials. You can see materials that have been in place for 200 years. In Halifax, North Carolina, wood and brick, and the way they were fashioned and put together has allowed them to weather with very little maintenance since that time. Why not do that today? One of the most important principles of building responsibly is to use materials wisely in such a way that they weather and they don't need a lot of maintenance. Well, I think sustainability has always been central to my work from the very first building I did. We didn't call it that back then. Back then, I just thought of it as common sense. To build as economically as possible, to use local materials, to have windows that open to the breeze, to plant trees or build underneath trees for shade. We all think of those now as being sustainable qualities, but to me they were just common sense. I think there's another principle that's very important, and it has to do with well-being. What does well-being mean? It means not only being healthy, but it also means being comfortable wherever you are. And I think in order to be comfortable with wherever we are, we need to have a sense of the history of that place, its natural qualities, what birds live there, where the winds blow. We feel at home in that place. Another thing that I've learned from vernacular architecture is the importance of building in such a way that we feel at home. I think that's even more important now than it used to be, because we live in a world where instantaneously we can be anywhere on the globe via the internet. And we tend to think that, what happens in London is just as applicable as it is here if you're thinking about building. My students sometimes show me examples of a project in India that they want to use in their own project, which is going to be in Salisbury, North Carolina, because they saw it on the internet. And I asked them, well, what's the climate where it's built, and what are the customs of the people, and what materials are commonly used? You don't get that when you learn from a screen. You learn that from being in the physical presence of something, and that's why I say the best things to learn from are the things that you can walk to.